The groom of the stool. Imagine applying for a job where the core, #1 with a bullet point qualification, is an intimate familiarity with the bowel movements of your boss. Now, imagine that boss is the King of England, and this job makes you one of the most powerful people in the entire country. This wasn't a fever dream. This was a highly coveted career. Welcome to the surreal world of the groom of the stool. On paper, the job description was simple: to assist the king in his most private moments of evacuation. The groom was responsible for the royal commode, known as the close stool, as well as providing the king with a bowl of water, a towel, and most critically, a flannel cloth for wiping. He was, in the most literal sense, the royal bathroom attendant. But here's the odd-wise twist. This job was never really about sanitation. It was about access. In the Tudor court of monarchs like Henry VIII, proximity was power. While dukes, ambassadors, and generals fought for a 30-second audience with the king in the crowded public throne room, the groom of the stool had him as a captive audience multiple times a day in a state of total vulnerability. This was the only time the king was truly alone with a single advisor. The groom of the stool wasn't just a servant, he was the king's most intimate confidant. He saw the monarch at his weakest, his most human, his most unwell. He knew the king's health better than the royal physicians. He knew his moods, his fears, and his secrets. Because of this, the position was exclusively granted to high-ranking noblemen, sons of aristocrats, or trusted friends of the king. The groom of the stool became a de facto personal secretary and treasurer. He managed the king's privy purse, a private fund of household finances that gave him immense economic influence. He would help the king dress and undress, sleep in a chamber next to his, and essentially act as his chief of staff. Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool to Henry VIII, became one of the most influential men in England, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber and a close friend, right up until he was accused of treason and adultery with Anne Boleyn and had his head chopped off. It turns out being that close to the king was the ultimate high-risk, high-reward career. It was a job that proved an unshakable historical truth. Power and disgust are often uncomfortably close neighbors. The Resurrectionist. If you took a stroll through a graveyard in the early 19th century, you might have noticed the landscape was different. Many graveyards were surrounded by high stone walls topped with iron spikes. Wealthy families interned their loved ones in iron-barred mort safes that looked like subterranean jail cells. Watchtowers were sometimes built overlooking the plots, manned by armed guards. This wasn't to keep the dead in, it was to keep the living out. Specifically, it was to stop the Resurrectionists. Resurrectionists, or body snatchers, had one of the most gruesome and illegal jobs in history. They stole fresh corpses from their graves and sold them. But here's the baffling part. Their primary customers weren't deviants or occultists. They were the most respected surgeons and anatomy professors in London and Edinburgh. The job existed because of a massive reality-distorting bottleneck in medical science. The law, clinging to old taboos, made it nearly impossible to legally acquire bodies for dissection. In Scotland, for example, the only legal supply of cadavers for anatomy schools was the bodies of executed murderers, which provided maybe 2 or 3 specimens a year. Meanwhile, medical science was exploding, and surgeons desperately needed to understand human anatomy to stop killing their patients. This gap between scientific need and legal supply created a booming, high-stakes black market. The Resurrectionists were the ghoulish middlemen. Working in total darkness, a team could excavate a fresh grave. They always targeted fresh ones, as decomposition ruined the product, in under an hour. They didn't bother with the whole coffin. They would dig a small hole at the head, use a crowbar to break the coffin lid, and hoist the body out with a rope. Critically, they only took the body, leaving the clothes and jewelry behind. This was a crucial legal distinction. Stealing a body was only a misdemeanor. Stealing the property in the grave with it, that was a felony. The most famous resurrectionists, William Burke and William Hare, famously decided to skip the whole digging part altogether. They realized it was far more efficient to murder vagrants and sell their fresher corpses directly to the medical schools. The scandal of their trial and execution directly led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which finally legalized the donation of unclaimed bodies to science. The resurrectionist's job reveals a chilling paradox. Our greatest leaps in medical knowledge were, for a time, fueled entirely by a criminal underworld that treated the dead as just another commodity. The Leech Collector. Imagine your job is to walk into a stagnant, muddy bog, roll up your pants, and just wait. You wait, standing in the filthy, sucking mud as dozens of tiny, slimy, blood-sucking parasites wriggle towards you, attaching themselves to your exposed legs. You feel the pinpricks as they latch on, their anesthetic-laced saliva numbing your skin as they begin to feed. Your job is to let them drink their fill, to become swollen and fat with your own blood, before you carefully pluck them off, one by one, and put them in a tin. You then move to a new patch of marshland and repeat the process, all day, every day. This was the life of the Leech Collector, or Hirudinja. It was, without question, one of the most miserable, disgusting, and dangerous jobs of the 19th century. And it was all thanks to one of the biggest medical blunders in history, bloodletting. For centuries, mainstream medicine was obsessed with the theory of the four humors, that all illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The cure for almost everything, from a fever to a headache to indigestion, was to rebalance the humors by, well, bleeding you. While physicians sometimes used a lancet, the natural method was preferred, leeches. This created a voracious, insatiable demand for medicinal leeches, Hirudo medicinalis. The leech craze of the 1830s was so intense that France, for example, imported over 40 million leeches in a single year. Wild populations were decimated, and someone had to go out and get the remaining ones from the most unpleasant places on Earth. That someone was the Leech Collector, typically a poor rural woman trying to scrape together a few pennies. The job was a slow-motion nightmare. Collectors suffered from chronic, massive blood loss, leading to anemia, fainting, and weakness. The hundreds of tiny wounds on their legs were constantly exposed to the filth of the swamp, resulting in horrific infections that were often septic and fatal. They were paid by the leech, so they were incentivized to stay in the water as long as possible, collecting as many as they could. Many collectors used old, sickly horses or donkeys, driving the poor animals into the water to be feasted upon, as their own bodies simply couldn't take any more blood loss. The job of the Leech Collector is a terrifying monument to a simple, brutal truth. When a flawed medical paradigm becomes dogma, it creates a real-world economy of human suffering. The Whipping Boy. Being born a prince in the 15th or 16th century sounds like you've won the lottery, but it came with a strange, unique problem, the divine right of kings. This was the belief that the king, and by extension his son the prince, was God's chosen representative on earth. This posed a serious educational dilemma for a royal tutor. How do you discipline a child who is, by definition, your superior? How do you spank a boy who could one day have you executed? You can't. It was seen as borderline blasphemous for a commoner to raise a hand against God's anointed. But princes are still children. They're lazy, they're defiant, and they refuse to learn their Latin. So the royal court invented one of the most psychologically bizarre jobs in human history, the whipping boy. The concept was a masterpiece of twisted logic. A young boy, usually the son of a high-ranking nobleman, would be selected to be the prince's constant companion. They would be educated together, play together, and lived together from a young age, forming a deep and powerful friendship. And then, whenever the prince misbehaved, the whipping boy would be taken away and brutally beaten for it. The prince, protected by his divine status, would be forced to watch as his best and only friend was flogged for a crime he himself committed. The theory was that the prince, being supposedly an empathetic human, would be so horrified by the sight of his friend's suffering that he would stop misbehaving to prevent it from happening again. It was, in essence, punishment by proxy. It was outsourced pain. This job is a psychological minefield. What did this do to the prince? Did it, as intended, teach him empathy and responsibility? Or did it teach him the exact opposite, that he was untouchable, that his actions had no consequences for himself, and that others would always suffer for his mistakes? And what about the whipping boy himself? He was a human shield, a living sin-eater whose entire function was to absorb the pain of another. This bizarre arrangement is perfectly captured in the relationship between the young Charles I of England and his whipping boy William Murray. They grew up as inseparable friends, and when Charles became king, he remained intensely loyal to Murray, making him the first Earl of Dysart. The job may have been brutal, but the bond it forged, a bond of shared trauma and misplaced guilt, was, it seems, unbreakable. The fuller. If you were a wealthy Roman citizen, you prided yourself on your toga virilis, a vast, brilliantly white woolen garment that signaled your status. But wearing a 20-foot-long white cloth while navigating the dusty, dirty, crowded streets of Rome meant it got filthy fast. You couldn't just throw it in the wash. Wool shrinks and mild soap was ineffective on deep grime and grease. To get it clean, you had to take it to a specialist, a fullo, the proprietor of a Roman laundry, or folonica. And the fuller had a secret ingredient, a potent industrial-strength cleaning agent, available in abundance, totally free, and guaranteed to cut through grime. That ingredient was human urine. The job of the fuller was to be a human washing machine powered by ammonia. The folonica was set up with a series of vats, or treading stalls. Workers, usually slaves, would place the dirty, greasy togas into the vats, which were then filled with water, a fuller's earth, a type of clay, and massive quantities of aged urine. The fuller's job was to then stomp and tread on the clothes, barefoot, for hours on end, pounding the grime and grease out of the wool. The ammonia in the urine was a powerful scouring agent that chemically stripped the oils and dirt, leaving the wool incredibly clean. After the stomping, the togas were rinsed and then hung on a massive dome-shaped wicker frame, where they were bleached even whiter using sulfur fumes. This job existed because of a simple, pre-industrial chemical reality. But it created a whole bizarre urban ecosystem. Fullers needed a lot of urine. So they placed large pots, or dolia, outside their shops and on street corners, encouraging passerby to relieve themselves. This became Rome's first public urinal system. The Emperor Vespasian even placed a urine tax on the collection and sale of this resource, which is what sparked the famous phrase, pecunia non olet, money does not stink. The job of the fuller was sweaty, exhausting, and reeked of ammonia. They were stomping in a chemical slurry of human waste all day, but they were also vital. They were the essential, if pungent, cog in the machine of Roman status and presentation. Their bizarre profession proves that long before the invention of synthetic detergents, humanity had already harnessed the power of organic chemistry in the most visceral way possible. The knocker-upper. Imagine a world with no electricity, a world with no digital clocks, no smartphones, and no sleep cycle alarms. Now, imagine it's 4 a.m. in Manchester, England, in the heart of the Industrial Revolution. The massive cotton mills are about to roar to life, and they demand thousands of workers at their gates on time every single time. If you're late, you're fired. But you live in a tiny, dark tenement room and you have no way to reliably wake up. How do you get to work? You hire a human alarm clock. This was the strange but essential job of the knocker-upper. For a few pence a week, this person would walk the pre-dawn, gas-lit streets with a very long, lightweight pole, often made of bamboo. Their one and only job was to go from house to house and tap, tap, tap on the bedroom windows of their clients, often on the second or third floor. The knocker-upper would not leave a window until they had a visual confirmation that the client was awake, often waiting for the worker to wave a hand or show a candle in the window. This profession was the analog human infrastructure of industrial time. The knocker-upper was, in a very real sense, the snooze button. In some towns, they used the pea shooter to rattle dried peas against the glass. In others, they used a snuffer-outer, a tool originally designed to extinguish gas lamps. This was a job of immense trust. The entire local economy depended on the reliability of the knocker-upper. If they overslept, an entire street of mill workers would be late, potentially losing their jobs. But this raises the ultimate odd-wise question. If the knocker-upper's job was to wake everyone else up, who woke up the knocker-upper? This isn't a joke, it's a genuine historical paradox. The answer, it seems, is that they simply didn't sleep properly. They were often elderly men or women who were light sleepers, or they simply trained themselves to wake up instinctively every few hours. They were, in effect, human insomniacs, whose biological glitch became a marketable, essential skill. The job survived well into the 1940s and 50s with the proliferation of reliable, cheap, wind-up alarm clocks. The Sin Eater. Imagine your father has just died. You are gathered around his deathbed in a small 18th century Welsh village. The local priest is here, but his rites can only do so much. You are consumed by a specific, gnawing terror that your father died with unconfessed sins on his soul, and he is now damned. To ensure his safe passage to the afterlife, you must perform one final, desperate ritual. You send for the Sin Eater. A gaunt, wretched-looking man, despised and shunned by the entire village, arrives at your door. He is the ultimate outcast. He enters the death room, where a loaf of bread and a bowl of ale have been placed on the chest of the corpse. The Sin Eater mutters an incantation. Then he picks up the bread and eats it. He lifts the bowl and drinks the ale. In doing so, he has performed a terrifying act of spiritual transference. He has eaten your father's sins, absorbing them into his own soul. He is paid a small fee, a few shillings, and then chased from the house, pelted with rocks and curses, for he is now a vessel of profound spiritual filth. The job of the Sin Eater is one of the most haunting professions in all of folklore, existing in the borderlands of ritual, desperation, and social taboo. This was not a church job, it was a folk magic job, practiced in secret, condemned by the religious authorities as a pagan and blasphemous ritual. But for the grieving and terrified poor, it was an essential service. It was a form of spiritual insurance, a last-ditch effort to cleanse a loved one's soul when the official channels of confession had failed. Who would even take such a job? Only the most desperate and marginalized people in society. The Sin Eater was a permanent pariah. They lived alone, often in remote woods, and were forbidden from interacting with other villagers. To look one in the eye was to invite bad luck. Their job was their identity, and their identity was a curse. They were a living sacrifice, willingly damning their own eternal soul in exchange for a few coins and scraps of funeral food so that others might be saved. It's a profession that reveals the raw, terrifying power of faith and the lengths people will go to mitigate the fear of death. The Ornatrix. In imperial Rome, the wife of a senator or wealthy aristocrat was not just a person, she was a walking, breathing political statement. And the most important part of that statement was her hair. Roman women's hairstyles became impossibly complex, architectural feats. They were towering structures of braids, curls, pins, and wires known as tutus. They were less hairstyles and more hair sculptures designed to communicate wealth, status, and adherence to the latest imperial fashion. But the aristocrat, the domina, certainly didn't do this herself. For that, she had a team of specialized slaves, and the lead stylist, the one responsible for the final sculpture, was the Ornatrix. This was not a job. This was a high-wire act of domestic servitude, where a single mistake could result in a brutal punishment. The Ornatrix was a highly skilled artisan, trained for years in the arts of hairdressing, wig-making, and cosmetology. Her tools were a terrifying array. She used a calanastrum, a hollow iron rod that was heated in hot coals, primitive curling iron to create perfect ringlets. She used primitive dyes made of soot, saffron, or worse. She used pins, needles, and fine-spun wires to hold the whole impossible structure in place. The whole process could take hours, during which the domina would sit, bored and impatient, holding a mirror. And if the Ornatrix made one mistake, the Roman poet Juvenal gives us a chilling account. He describes a domina enraged that a single curl is out of place. She, quote, takes a whip and flogs the Ornatrix for her mistake. This wasn't a bad day at the salon. This was a master-slave relationship built on a foundation of terror and aesthetic perfection. The slave girl's body was on the line for the perfect hairstyle. This job is a dark window into the Roman concept of status. The more elaborate and useless the hairstyle, the more it signaled that the wearer was so wealthy she had a team of highly skilled slaves who did nothing but this. The Ornatrix's job was to create an icon of leisure, a symbol of power built on her own powerlessness. It was a profession where art and profound cruelty were woven together, pin by pin, braid by braid. The Gong Farmer. London in the 16th century was a city of marvels. It was also a city drowning in its own filth. With no public sewer system, every household, from the poorest hovel to the richest manor, disposed of its human waste in a privy, or gong. This was essentially a toilet that emptied into a large brick-lined pit in the backyard or basement called a cesspit. Over time, these pits would fill up, and when they did, when the stench became unbearable and the gong began to overflow, you had to call in a professional. You had to call the Gong Farmer. Gong was a medieval word for, well, shit. And the Gong Farmer, or night man, was the official human waste collector of the Tudor era. This was, without exaggeration, the worst job in the city. And it was legally mandated to be. Gong farmers were forbidden by law from working in the daylight, as the sight and smell of their work was considered a public nuisance. They could only work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. A team of gong farmers would arrive in the dead of night, light a few lanterns, and begin their stomach-churning task. One man, the whole man, would be lowered down into the cesspit, often standing neck-deep in a slurry of decomposing human excrement. His job was to shovel the gong into buckets. His partners, the rope men, would then hoist the full buckets up and dump them into a cart. The fumes alone, a potent, suffocating mixture of methane and hydrogen sulfide, were a constant hazard. Workers were known to suffocate and die in the pits. But this wasn't just a job. It was a vital public service. The gong farmers were the only things standing between the city and a catastrophic outbreak of cholera or typhoid. And they were, in their own way, pioneers of recycling. The night soil they collected was immensely valuable. They would cart it out of the city and sell it to actual farmers, who would use the nutrient-rich human manure to fertilize their fields. This created a closed-loop system, a waste-to-food chain that, while disgusting, was incredibly efficient. The gong farmer was despised, socially ostracized, and forced to work in the dark, but he was the most important sanitation worker of his time, a man who built a career, quite literally, from the bottom up. The Powder Monkey. The Age of Sail, a warship like the HMS Victory, was the most complex and terrifying weapon on Earth. It was a floating wooden fortress, bristling with over 100 cannons. In the heat of battle, these cannons consumed a truly mind-boggling amount of gunpowder. The gun deck was a hellscape of smoke, fire, splintering wood, and thunderous noise. And running back and forth through this chaos, delivering the vital explosive charges to the cannon crews, were the smallest, youngest, and most vulnerable members of the entire crew, the powder monkeys. This job was reserved for boys, sometimes as young as 10 or 11 years old. This wasn't a case of bring your kid to work day. It was a deliberate, tactical military strategy. The boys were chosen for their size. A full-grown man was too large a target and too valuable to be wasted on simple logistics. The small, nimble body of a child could weave and duck through the low-ceilinged gun decks, avoiding ropes and officers and wounded sailors far more efficiently than an adult. Their job was to run down to the ship's magazine, a heavily protected room deep in the hull where the gunpowder was stored, pick up cartridges, and sprint them back to a specific cannon over and over again. They were called monkeys because of their agility. They were also, crucially, barefoot. This was a safety requirement. A single nail in a boot striking the copper-plated floor of the magazine could create a spark, blowing the entire ship and its 800-man crew to smithereens. The powder monkey was a living, breathing part of the ship's firing mechanism. He was a piece of logistical hardware, a small cog in a massive machine of death. The job was, of course, unimaginably dangerous. They were constantly exposed to enemy fire, horrific injuries from wood splinters, and the deafening roar of their own cannons, which left most of them partially or fully deaf. This was child labor in its most extreme and terrifying form, where a child's small stature wasn't seen as a vulnerability, but as a tactical advantage to be exploited. It's a chilling reminder that in the calculus of war, human resources has often been a terrifyingly literal term.